You know, some people look out into our world and they see only chaos. Malcolm Gladwell looks out and into, and he sees tipping points, or the power of blink, or the difference between a puzzle and a mystery. He's the kind of brain that Sir Ken Robinson is talking about, a creative thinker, an analyst, who somehow perhaps kept it as he entered his adult life. I think the term for him is a psychosociologist, and you can take that for whatever you want it to be. I don't think it means what it sounds like. My first impression of him when I met him just briefly is that he's very modest, even shy, and yet he understands humanity in flashes of genius, and then he makes it look so simple to the rest of us. He might be demure, but he is certainly a one-man power surge. Please welcome Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today in front of all of you, although I should say that I was recently giving a talk at a college, and at the end of the talk, this very attractive young woman stood up and she said, "Mr. Gladwell, I like your writing very much. Will you marry me?" When it comes to audiences, the bar is quite high for me at the moment. I'm very happy to be following by a few speakers Sir Ken Robinson, because what I have to say is really a kind of continuation of what he had to say. He was talking about the importance of imagination and creativity, and what I really want to talk about is, what does that word creativity mean? And does it come in more than one form? And I think it does. And I want to talk about that by talking about two artists that you'll all be very familiar with, Paul Cézanne and Pablo Picasso. Now, these are two of the most famous artists of all time, right? They're considered to be geniuses. Their paintings sell not just for millions of dollars, but for tens of millions of dollars. Every great museum in the world wants to have works of art by these two men, and we lump them together in this category of extraordinary innovator, great creator. But in fact, they are, in one critical respect, profoundly different. Now, the idea behind their differences comes from a man named David Galenson, who's an economist, and he wrote this really wonderful book where he talked about how innovation or creativity takes two particular forms. The first form, he said, is conceptual innovation. And a conceptual innovator is someone who begins with a big, bold, revolutionary idea, an idea that they can express very clearly and concisely, and they can execute very quickly. Right? These are the kind of people who when they open their mouths and they say what they have to say, we go, oh my goodness, and we're overwhelmed by this thing that changes the way we look out on the world. He also said there are people that he calls experimental innovators, and the experimental innovator never has the big, bold idea. They never wake up one morning and say, eureka, right? They don't work that way. Rather, what they do is they gather all kinds of information from here and there, and they go and they try something, then they try it again, then they make it just a little bit better, and they go over and over and over the same material for years and years and years, until finally what emerges is something that approximates genius. Now, Pablo Picasso is the perfect example of the conceptual innovator. Here's a man who, at a very young age, has a series of incredibly revolutionary ideas about art. And he executes them incredibly quickly and brilliantly. And they change the way people look at modern art forever. Right? And he does, over the course of his career, what he has is a series of these epiphanies over and over again, each time that he expresses in this extraordinary way. Cézanne, completely different. What Cézanne does is he never has a big, bold idea. Rather, he starts off doing something incredibly conventional and does it for years and paints the same kind of thing over and over and over again, until over the course of his career, gradually he begins to move into a new and really fascinating area, and then his genius emerges. Right? He works empirically, he works iteratively, he works through trial and error. He doesn't execute quickly and easily and brilliantly some idea that has come to him, in a flash. Now, if you think about that difference, it makes a profound difference in how quickly each of those artists matures. If you have a big, bold idea and you can execute it really quickly. It means you can do your best work very early on in your career. And sure enough, when you look at Pablo Picasso, you see that he peaks as an artist at a very young age. Cézanne is very different. If you're someone who's doing something over and over and over again and working through trial and error and gathering all kinds of information, it means you're not going to hit your peak until well into your career. Now, if we compare those two artists, Galenson does this wonderful thing called an age-price profile. And he basically says, he looks at the prices paid by people for the art of those two artists, and how do those prices differ over the course of their careers. And what you find out if you do that analysis is that Picasso painted his most valuable paintings when he was 26 years old. And a painting painted by Picasso in his 20s is worth, on average, about 4 times what a painting painted by Picasso at the end of his life is worth. His best work is really front-loaded in his career. Cézanne, completely the opposite. A painting painted by Cézanne in his 60s is worth 15 times more than something painted by Cézanne in his 20s. People don't go to museums and look at the stuff Cézanne was doing before the age of 50. It's not there. There was a big Cézanne exhibit at the Met last year, and you could walk around, and many of his greatest paintings were there. You would not see a single thing painted in the first half of his career. Why? Because the stuff he paints in the first half of his career wasn't any good. It took him a lifetime to get to that point of creative genius that we associate with that artist. Now, what Galenson argues is that you can look at almost any artist and you can divide them into these categories. Either they are precocious artists who have big ideas like Picasso, or they're late bloomers like Cézanne, who work in this kind of slow, iterative, trial and error kind of way. So think about, for example, two of the great American novels, greatest American novels ever. Moby Dick and Huck Finn. Right? How old is Melville when he writes Moby Dick? A book, by the way, that transforms the way we think about the novel. A truly revolutionary work of art. How old is Melville? He's 32 years old. Does he do anything of real lasting value after Moby Dick? Not really. He's basically done. How old is Mark Twain when he writes Huckleberry Finn? He's 50. Do you know how long it took him to write Huck Finn? 8 years. And why did it take him 8 years? Because he was stopping and starting and revising and rewriting, and he couldn't figure out the ending. In fact, the big problem with Huck Finn, of course, is the ending, if you remember that. But he's a classic experimental innovator. He's a man who needed to take his time to go over things over and over again, who needed to revise and revise and revise until finally he works out this thing later on in his life. That's not how Melville worked. Melville sat down and wrote Moby Dick. It just poured out of him, right? And boom, he was done. Think about film directors. Who are the 2 of the greatest film directors of all time? Hitchcock, Orson Welles, right? What's Orson Welles' greatest work? Citizen Kane. How old is he when he directs Citizen Kane? He's 26. That is a movie that completely transforms the way we understand modern cinema. The man conceives of it and executes it when he is 26 years old. He's a baby, right? Hitchcock. What's Hitchcock's greatest film? Well, we could sit here and argue, but I'll make the case for Vertigo. How old is Hitchcock when he does Vertigo? 59. He reaches his creative peak after a lifetime of working in the same genre over and over again until he got it right? Did the thriller, the mystery, one time after another, till finally he perfects it at an age when we don't normally associate with someone's creative peak. Now, I think that division that Galenson has come up with between the experimental and the conceptual innovator is extraordinarily important. It's incredibly meaningful. And I think it describes not just famous artists, but also organizations, companies. In fact, all of us, I think, have elements of creativity that fall into one of those 2 camps. And I think it's even more important because something very distressing has happened in our society over the last generation or so. And that is, I think we have turned our back on Cézanne and embraced Picasso. We have decided that instead of there being 2 modes of creativity in the world that need to be nurtured, we have decided we're only interested in the first kind. We don't care anymore about late bloomers. We're only interested in precocious creative people. Let me give you an example of this. And it's from the world of music. A friend of mine is a record executive, and he asked me recently, and this will date me, he said, Malcolm, what do you think the greatest Fleetwood Mac album is? And I said, well, it's Rumors, of course, right? Sells 19 million copies, is one of the great rock and roll albums of all time. And he says, yes, you're absolutely right. That is their best album. Then he said, what number album do you think that is in the lifespan, in the discography of Fleetwood Mac? And I said, well, I know they did that self-titled album before called Fleetwood Mac, right? And then, I don't know, I hadn't heard of anything else they'd done. I'm guessing maybe they did one, or maybe it's their third album. He said, wrong. It's their 16th album. Right? Now, at this point, I'm going to do a little digression. I don't really have time for it, but it's important. I'm going to give you a little capsule history of Fleetwood Mac, because it's critical. Fleetwood Mac is formed in the mid-'60s in London by a guy named Peter Green, who gets together with Mick Fleetwood, who's a drummer, and these two other guys, a guy named Spencer and Bunning. And they have this band, and they play all these clubs in England, and they do lots of drugs, and they hang out with the Rolling Stones, and they come to America, and then Peter Green, it gets incredibly complicated. I'm going to have to fast forward it. But basically, they fire those two guys, and they bring in two other guys. And then Peter Green does a huge amount of LSD and joins a shadowy German cult. And they have to replace him with a guy named Danny Kerwin. And then they bring in a woman named Christine Perfect, who later marries John McVie, who becomes Christine McVie. And then they all go to this, they buy this big decrepit mansion in Hampshire called Benefolds, and they smoke huge amounts of hashish, and they raise goats, and their kids run around naked. And then they hire these guys, this guy named Stewart and some other guy, but Dave Weston, and then they fire them because those guys have an affair with Mick Fleetwood's then girlfriend, although being called an adulterer by Mick Fleetwood is, of course, like being called ugly by a frog. But then they had this sort of minor hit in Europe with an instrumental, and then they run into this American guy named Bob Welch at a railway station, and they hire him, and they move to America, to Los Angeles, and Mick Fleetwood's in a supermarket, and he runs into a friend of his who has a recording studio in Van Nuys, and he says, come to my studio, and Mick Fleetwood does, and he spots this really cute girl, Stevie Nicks, who's with her ex-boyfriend, Lindsey Buckingham, and he thinks she's really hot. And then Bob Welch quits Fleetwood Mac, and Mick Fleetwood says, what about the hot girl? And the hot girl is working as a waitress in a restaurant in Hollywood called Clementine's, and it's like a flapper. She's wearing a flapper outfit. It's a 20s themed restaurant. And they go and they meet her, and they all get really, really drunk, and they think that she's the greatest, and they have this all-night writing session, and they go and they record an album in the basement of the ICM building on Beverly Drive, and that's the album Fleetwood Mac. And then 9 months later, they come out with Rumors, and it's 19 million copies, and they take over the world. Now, that little history I've just described to you, that's 10 years, right? That's, in total, I think 18 different people moved in and out of Fleetwood Mac before they settled on the 5 people that were the great band that they were. And over the course of those 10 years, they go through an extraordinary evolution. They started as a blues band. They're like one of those English bands that pretend that they're black and from Memphis. And then they become like a really progressive band, and they wear berets, and they play for hours, and they look off into the distance. And then they were a loud band. They were the loud band that if you wanted I don't know what that means, but they were the loud band that you hired. And then they were a party band, and they would hang condoms filled with milk from the pegs of their guitars and throw them out into the audience, right? It's the California sound that we associate with Fleetwood Mac doesn't happen until 1973 with the album Heroes Are Hard to Find, which I hope none of you actually wasted money on. But they don't come to that music that we associate with them until they've been on the road playing and existing as a band and going through all these iterations for 8 or 9 years. Right? Fleetwood Mac is Cezanne. Now, compare them to the Eagles. We often lump those two bands together because they come out at the same time, and they are both examples of this California sound. But the Eagles could not be more different. The Eagles form in 1972. They have a '1 record by 1973. They put out their second album in 1974. They put out their greatest hits in an act of actually extraordinary audacity in 1975. They hit their creative peak with Hotel California in 1976. They have a clearly defined idea about what music is. They execute it really quickly, and they peak at the very beginning of their career. They are Picasso. Now, think about the person, the record executive, who handled Cezanne, who handled Fleetwood Mac back in those early days. Why were they able to benefit from Rumors and the album before that, which collectively made that record company not just millions of dollars, but hundreds of millions of dollars? Why were they able to capitalize on Fleetwood Mac? Because they had an idea in their head of what creativity was. Because they believed that creativity came in more than one form. That not every band could be precocious and could come out with a hit record on its first album. That sometimes you had to wait. And that record executive was willing to wait for 10 years. And what happened because they were willing to wait for 10 years? They were rewarded with one of the greatest selling albums of all time. Now, what happens if you go to the record industry today? How long are they willing to wait for someone to mature? Not 10 years anymore. Not 5 years. Not 1 year. If you go to someone in the record industry, they will tell you they will wait for the first single. If the first single doesn't hit, boom, you're gone. I submit to you that tells you more about what's wrong with the record industry than anything else you can come up with. They are in the creative straits that they are right now, the financial straits that they are right now, because they've decided, for no real logical reason, that they're only interested in Picasso and they're not interested in Cezanne anymore. Let me give you another example. Think about the automobile industry. Think about what distinguishes Detroit from Japan. Well, there are many things that distinguish them, but I think one of the ways that they are distinguished is that Detroit and Japan have very different ideas about what creativity means. Detroit is an industry that has, over the last 40 years, distinguished itself by a series of really brilliant conceptual breakthroughs, right? The Mustang in the early 60s, the small sports car, the muscle car in the late 60s, the minivan in the late 70s, the SUV in the late 1980s. These are all really brilliant ideas about, conceptual ideas about how to move yourself around by vehicle that have the effect of transforming the way that Americans think about cars, right? And these are, they're ideas that are very easy to express and very quick to execute, and that have the effect of sustaining Detroit over the last 30 years. Compare them to Japan. Has there ever been a conceptual innovation that has come out of Japan? I don't think so. On the contrary, what they have spent their time doing is focused on things like reliability and manufacturing excellence and customer service and technological sophistication, all of which are a very different kind of trade, right? These are the kinds of things you have to work hard on over and over again, come back to, take a lot longer to master. I mean, think about something like the hybrid engine, which is the reigning symbol of the superiority of the dominance of Japan over Detroit. Is the hybrid engine a conceptual breakthrough? No. The idea of twinning an electrical engine and a gasoline engine has been around for as long as we've had engines. Someone had that idea in 1905. The reason we never had hybrid engines was it's really hard to build a hybrid engine. If you've got two engines side by side, you want to switch back and forth between them, it's very hard not to have the car shudder and shake and make strange noises every time you go back and forth. And for years and years and years, everyone said that shuddering and the shaking and strange noises is such a problem, I can't figure it out. They gave up. Well, the Japanese didn't give up. They said, oh, that's probably a problem we can solve if we spend 10 years and $10 billion. And you know what? They did. They spent 10 years and $10 billion and they solved it. And as a result, they got a commanding lead over Detroit in that very critical area. Japan is Cezanne. And Detroit is Picasso. I realize that's the first time that phrase has ever been uttered. And I would submit to you the crisis that Detroit has gone through over the last few years is the crisis of an industry that has depended solely on one form of innovation, right? The form that requires you to come up with a brilliant new idea, right? And has run out of brilliant new ideas. Nothing else to stand on, right? Fall back on. Now, why are we in this position of defining creativity so narrowly? And of focusing only on Picasso's and forgetting about Cezanne? Well, it has to do with patience. That's the common element in all of this. If you look at what happened in the record industry, it's that record executives were no longer willing to be patient with a band like Fleetwood Mac, to wait 10 years to see if they were going to make it or not. If you look at Detroit and why they didn't solve the hybrid engine puzzle, it's that they weren't willing to be patient with that kind of technology. They weren't interested in a project that might not bear fruit for 10 or 15 years. Right? We have gotten into our heads somehow that unless something pays off really quickly and shows immediate dividends, it isn't of any value. And that is a profoundly dangerous idea. Right? If Picasso and Cézanne were companies, investors would put all their money in Picasso and they would forget about Cézanne. Right? He'd have gone bankrupt. Okay? And we would have been robbed of one of the great geniuses of the world of art. Well, that same idea, I think, has begun to infect our ideas about education. I think we've also run out of patience when it comes to looking at the potential of students, of kids. We have pushed the date at which we make up our minds about whether someone has potential or not lower and lower and lower. And we say that now we want to decide whether a kid's any good or not at 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or whatever, at some very early age. And we justify that by saying this is because this is in the name of rigor. It's in the name of higher standards. It's in the name of creating a better and stronger school system. But it's not. Right? What it's really about is defining creativity and innovation so narrow as to be only interested in the precocious kind of creativity and to turn our backs on the late bloomer. And ask yourself, do we really want that as a society? Do we want to have art museums that are only filled with Picassos and have no room for Cézannes? Thanks very much.
How do you reach out into this broad world and come up with the topics that you come up with? Tipping point, Blink, and what we just heard today, your quick assessment of creativity and what's gone wrong.
You're asking me how I do it?
Yeah.
I have no idea. I think I talk to lots of interesting people. I mean, it's also my job to do it. I mean, I don't do anything else. So it's not like... If you had my schedule, you'd also come up with as many. Trust me, you would. It's just, it's rolling out of bed at 11, sitting there looking at the stars, reading books when the rest of you are hard at work.
Are you writing another book now?
I have just finished the first draft, yes.
And the title?
I don't have a title, which is a problem.
Malcolm Gladwell.